freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
We're going to get started. Welcome to this special live recording of So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I want to welcome new listeners because today's live recording is done alongside the First Amendment Watch. They are a co-sponsor of today's recording. The First Amendment Watch, if you don't know them and you're a regular listening to this show, they produce lots of educational materials, news, commentary, and additional materials about the First Amendment, and they're based at NYU, that is New York University. And we're so glad to be sponsoring this event with them about Jakob Mushangama's new book called Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, which is due out, I believe it's next Tuesday, right, Jakob? February 8th?
February, yep.
And you're coming to us for the United States right now. You're based overseas doing a book tour, but you're also in addition to the author of this excellent new book, the executive director of the Danish think tank Justitia. And I want to welcome you back onto the show because I think you've been a guest 2 previous times.
Thank you so much, Nico. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
And we have a panel here to discuss your book, and I'm glad to say that all 3 of our other panelists have also been previous guests on the show. Of course, there is Greg Lukianoff. He's my boss. He is the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and the co-author, most recently, of The Coddling of the American Mind. Greg, you're a few offices down from me. Welcome back.
It's great to be back. I was on medical leave for shoulder surgery, so I'm very excited to celebrate Jakob's book. I've been excited about it for years.
And then we also have another author who was on the podcast a couple of years ago to discuss his book. That's Professor Stephen Solomon. He's the founding editor at First Amendment Watch and the director of NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute and the author of the aforementioned book, Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. Welcome back to the show, Stephen.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
And then another previous guest of the show, Sarah McLaughlin, who is the director of FIRE's Targeted Advocacy Program, where she focuses on art censorship and U.S. colleges' relationships with international threats to free speech. Sarah, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So the plan of attack, we've got a number of guests here, and we're doing it remotely, which can always be a little bit difficult. I've got some prepared questions that are going to tie in with Jakob's book, and then I want to open up the floor to listener questions. I think we had something like 200 or over 200 guests register to attend this live recording, so to speak, so we want to hear from you. I'm going to try and keep my prepared questions to 30 minutes. And because the history of free speech covered in Jakob's book is so vast, we agreed beforehand to focus on how lessons from free speech movements throughout world history can help us overcome and shed some light on today's divisions over the value of free speech. But that doesn't mean we can't go wherever the conversation takes us, and I encourage everyone on this call, to the extent that they have questions related to other free speech topics or modern free speech topics, to ask those. And then a final reminder that 50 copies of Jakob's book, Free Speech, will be given out at random to attendees of tonight's live recording. And our producer, Jackie, told us that you can expect emails in your inbox tomorrow if you want a copy. So let's just dive right in. Jakob, your new book uses the egalitarian versus elitist conceptions of free speech as kind of a core framing device through your journey through free speech history. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose that device and what those schools of thoughts are?
Yeah, I really found it to be sort of a recurring pattern throughout the history of free speech, really back to ancient times. So I argue that the egalitarian concept of free speech originated in the Athenian democracy, where they had sort of 2 concepts of free speech. One of them was isegoria, equality of speech, which was more like political free speech, which all freeborn male citizens could exercise in the political assembly in their direct democracy. And then they had parousia, which is uninhibited speech, which permeated the culture of the Athenian democracy. Of course, by our modern standards, the egalitarianness of the Athenian democracy was not so impressive. But by the standards of the day, they were quite radical. And then on the other hand, you had the Roman Republic, where you also had free speech ideals, but where it was more top down. So it was an elite, a well-educated elite, senators like Cato, like Cicero, who exercised free speech, and where they were much more cautious about letting the unwashed mob exercise free speech in assemblies and so on. And you see that conflict really throughout the history of free speech, all the way up until today, where social media and the internet really has reignited this debate, where you could say that those who are the elite, those who have a privileged access to the public sphere, who act as sort of institutionalized gatekeepers, are always really concerned when new technologies or new political developments expands the public sphere to previously voiceless groups, and those have included sort of the poor and propertyless, women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and so on. And today, it's really about whether it's irresponsible to let everyone say whatever they want on social media, or whether we need platforms and or governments to purge different kinds of speech that is deemed dangerous by elites. So that's really a recurring theme throughout the history of free speech, and it's amazing to see how many statements made, Erasmus, the great humanist scholar who wrote, hundreds of books and pamphlets himself, sort of complaining in the 1500s about how printers of books and pamphlets were sort of flooding the public sphere with mad and impious ideas that were dangerous and full of lies, which sounds really similar to some of the complaints we hear about social media today. So that's a recurring theme throughout the book.
And then in those cases, the people who were advocating for the limitations on the distribution of some of those pamphlets, or the limitations on the excesses of the printing press, for example, they would be elitist under your framework, right? The idea that information should be limited to a certain elite that can handle it, right? The unwashed masses can't.
Yeah, and actually, someone like Voltaire, who's often sort of seen as a free speech absolutist, is a very good example of someone who is in favor of sort of elitist free speech. He's not in favor of the unwashed mob. Enlightenment is for the enlightened. It's not for everyone. But these attitudes are also linked to what I call in the book Milton's curse, which is that a lot of people adopt sort of unprincipled views. They are in favor of free speech for some, but not for all. And that goes back to John Milton, the famous author of Areopagitica, who was in favor of abolishing pre-publication censorship, but not really when it came to Catholics or atheists or other people who had irresponsible and dangerous views. And you still see that, and that's a fascinating modern example. So if you go to 2006, when Barack Obama was a junior senator from Illinois, he had this podcast where he was attacked. He was in favor of net neutrality, and he praised the internet for being this uncensored space that allowed him to say whatever he wanted without any gatekeepers. And of course, he used social media to really impressive effects as this outsider who sort of upended the traditional elites in his party as a minority and as a junior senator. So social media was instrumental for him for winning the so-called Facebook generation. And then fast forward to 2020, and in an interview in The Atlantic, he suddenly calls social media the gravest danger gravest threat to our democracy. So that's a good example of someone adopting the elitist free speech position, as well as falling for sort of falling into the trap of Milton's curse of sort of saying, I enjoyed free speech and social media when it benefited me, but now I no longer think it's such a great idea because people whom I don't like have taken advantage of it, and that is very prevalent. And of course, it's been very much the 2016 presidential election that changed institutional and elitist attitudes towards social media. It was sort of hailed as with the Arab Spring, and many people thought that social media would bring democracy and freedom to the world, and then they found out that free speech has costs and can also include harms, and gives voices to people that you really don't like.
Well, let's talk about
difficult
that.
To handle.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. And I do want to encourage our listeners who are listening to us live, if they have any questions, to put them in the chat. And then our producer, Jackie, will feed them to us. If you would leave your name, or if you want to remain anonymous, that's an option too. But we tend to think of our modern free speech controversies as new, right? But you kind of frame the social media debate in the context of past technologies as well, frame it in the egalitarian versus elitist mold. And we always look at the historical elitists, so to speak, as kind of the villains, right? They worked out their problems then, and now they can be seen as villains. But this is a very relevant conversation, of course, because we're having this disinformation debate about social media and about new media right now with Joe Rogan, for example, and his placement on Spotify. So, Greg, I want to ask you, how should we think about this disinformation debate? In the elitist egalitarian context, does regulating disinformation make one an elitist and therefore, kind of from the perspective of history, a censor? Or am I thinking about it too wrong?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this. Well, one thing that I want to say before getting to that is just, although I had lots of issues with David Graeber's The Beginning of Everything book that came out, one thing that he does make a point of saying, and I think there's probably some truth here, is there might have been a lot more Athenian type societies, ones with sort of proto-democratic or tribal arrangements that were more creative and more interesting than we'll ever know. And that free speech in a small scale society, particularly when you're trying to decide what to do, there has to be some amount of like give and take and talk about what to do. So I actually think in some ways the history we're just missing like a big middle there, because there's this vast, like 5,000 years where we know very little about what their social arrangements were like. When it comes to the disinformation thing, I think we are doing something very foolish at the moment. I think that we are facing an epistemic crisis, and I thought this was really very well put by the vice president of Substack, who, by the way, wants to come on the show. Nico, I talked to her. She just had her third kid, so she's on. I
DM'd her on Twitter, and she never responded to me.
Yeah,
but she went viral there for a second.
Yeah, no, but her position is great, because like one of the things that we seem to think. Now, disinformation is a very real problem, but people tend to think there's some kind of easy solution, and the easy solution is called omniscience, knowing everything, having perfect knowledge, and that's not a real thing. So, but there are ways to abuse it. What we need are people that we actually trust, and gatekeepers that we trust. But right now, trust is at a very low ebb, in part because there is this mistaken idea that if we shut down the wrong speech, that's going to make the productive speech, it's going to make sure that our debate stays productive. But it has the opposite effect. So, for example, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post this morning about the Ilya Shapiro situation at Georgetown University Law School. And my point in it is that I don't think academia gets that. And quickly for the audience, this is a professor. He was just hired to be the head of the Constitutional Law Center after Biden announced that that he was going to nominate a African American woman. Shapiro said, "I actually support this Indian American man, who I think is actually the most qualified." And it's and he put it badly. He said it's like, but people are always going to think that it went to the lesser black woman. offensive way of putting it. He apologized, but what he was getting at was an opinion that is actually kind of common. I cited an ABC News poll that said something like 76% and like a majority of Democrats even think that it should be the nomination should be decided regardless of gender or race. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at if people, if the point of having an institution like higher education is to produce experts that we all trust, but it's pretty clear that even arguments that are popular among Americans that are considered relatively mainstream are ones that can actually get you fired on campus, people stop trusting the experts because you start saying, but if the answer was anything but that, you wouldn't even tell me anyway. So I think we're facing an epistemic crisis from multiple directions, both from the reality of disinformation and from the reality of governments like Putin and China trying to mess with us, but also from the solution itself can create additional trust problems.
Yeah, and Stephen, I want to bring you in here because historically one of the vehicles we've used to sort truth from falsity, in addition to institutions, at least in the COVID context, like the CDC or the government, is our news media, right? And you're at a school of journalism, so from that perspective, how do you, and also the perspective of free speech activists such as yourself, an educator, how do you think about the disinformation debate that's happening right now?
I think there's a lot of parts to it. So there's long been disinformation by the government as well, right? I mean, the Vietnam War, the justification for going into Iraq, the government itself engages in a lot of disinformation. So it's not only the enlargement of the public sphere that's done that. But I think once you do enlarge the public sphere, as has happened with social media, then and people are directed into echo chambers where they hear information and opinions that confirm their own viewpoint, and it can get more and more out there to the left or to the right, and without any regard to whether it's true. Then there's no brakes. There's no internal brakes for that. Ideally, with social media, you'd be put, if you want to call it chambers, it wouldn't be an echo chamber. It would be a chamber where there's all kinds of different opinions, and you read and you discuss with other people in that group, and you learn from that. But that's not the way it works. So it was a similar thing back in colonial times when this public sphere grew as well. I mean, it started with the elite publishing newspapers, right? There were only about 25 newspapers at the time of the revolution, and the public sphere quickly grew with liberty trees and liberty poles and things like that. And so some of that speech was simply false. I think when you get into political debate, it's just natural for people to exaggerate and put things out there that just don't stand critical scrutiny.
So Sarah, this is my own personal philosophy and kind of the philosophy that I've gotten from Jakob's book as well. The idea that censors can often win in the short term. They can burn Giordano Bruno. They can put Galileo on house arrest. But usually in the long term, they can't completely snuff out new ideas or dissent. But we have a lot of new technologies. I'm curious if that changes anything. You see what China's doing with its Great Firewall, and even disinformation, the ability to disseminate it more widely than we have historically. You don't often need to censor people, for example, in order to snuff out an idea. You can just flood the zone with a bunch of crap. And Peter Pomerantsev talks about this being the strategy in Russia, for example, in his book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Like, Russia does censor, right? There are very few media organs that exist there that aren't arms of the state currently. But they also just flood the zone with disinformation, so nobody knows what to believe. And therefore, they're just kind of ambivalent to the truth at a certain point. So how do you think about these new technologies and their effectiveness in censorship from a historical standpoint? More effective, less effective?
It's hard to say. I think one point that Jakob makes in his book is that we have more speech than ever today. And he's completely right. But what's fascinating to watch is how we have all this more speech and how it actually kind of gets people the attention of the censors. So we see this a lot, today with China. We'll have people who, tweet something. We have social media. We have this way to speak to billions of people, millions of people that we never could imagine, a few decades ago. But when you can speak to a lot of people, it turns out that a lot of people are listening who might not like what you say. And so it's kind of, it's creating this idea of like transnational repression, where since you can be heard by so many people, it turns out that these censors who are thousands of miles away from you can hear you too, and they might try to do something about what you're saying.
Yeah, but didn't that happen with Erdogan in Turkey, right? Wasn't there a poet in Germany who wrote a poem or something, or said something out against him, and then he's, of course, very thin-skinned. I hope he doesn't come after me after saying that. But, the effects of speech now, as you say, cross borders, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The case you're referencing, there was a TV comedian who read a very offensive poem about Erdogan, which I will not repeat here. You can look it up yourself if you'd like to. But Erdogan attempted to sue him. He was trying to use Germany's, at the time they had a law against insulting heads of state. He was trying to get that applied against this comedian. One thing that I do think is interesting, I'm on the whole somewhat pessimistic about, free speech and, emerging technologies. But one story that caught my attention, which is, somewhat positive. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in Hong Kong, there's a university where there was this, large memorial for the Tiananmen massacre.
Oh yeah, I saw the story. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was, kind of taken down. I think there's like a lounge that's been put in its place in case you want to sit there and think about censorship. But people are actually now, they have models where you can 3D print your own mini version of the statue, and it's obviously not a perfect solution, but I do think we should at least pay attention to the small ways of resistance that new technologies can provide us when we're seeing this kind of mass scale of censorship that is occurring in Hong Kong.
Jakob, it strikes me that, and this comes across in your book, that we often revere the righteousness of our historical heretics, but are committed to silencing and destroying our modern heretics. Right? It's like the perspective of history gives you a sort of distance from the heretic that allows you to also embrace them.
Sure.
So is it possible to determine in one's modern time, from your research throughout history, the heretic who will be vindicated by history, or can history only determine that? Can you separate them, the truthful heretic, from the quack grifter? Or are we all doomed to look absurd by the long arc of history? For example, I think of Thomas Paine, right? Who is revered today, but died a pauper.
And was hated, was hated by absolutely hated by many people. I do doubt that Alex Jones will be regarded as a champion of free speech and a prophet of truth and righteousness in 100 years, even though he was purged from social media sort of almost overnight. But quite clearly, it's quite possible and very likely that there are people now who have said things that rub a lot of people the wrong way, who have been fired from a university or whatever, and who will be vindicated by history later on. So that is very difficult to determine. But I'd like to sort of go to your question about China. China is definitely has become a huge juggernaut, and it's sort of created these digital client states where it's exporting its technology to a lot of authoritarian states to allow them to keep protests down. But it's interesting. So if you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag, the archipelago, he talks about how the Gulag system was really only possible because of the hardcore censorship of the Soviet Union, especially during the Stalinist era. So very few people knew really what was going on in the Gulag system, didn't know the scope of it, and few stories really came out. But then you have sort of the Chinese equivalent in Xinjiang, where they've built these massive labor camps or concentration camps or whatever you want to call them, where they put Uyghurs, predominantly Muslims, in them. And technology has been absolutely instrumental in exposing it. So you've been able to use, satellites, smuggle out videos on cell phones and so on. So China has not been able to obfuscate the scale of that giant repression in the same way that Stalin could sort of mostly hide some of the incredible scale of crimes that went on in the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I think let's not forget that there are ways I'd also like to highlight someone like Bellingcat, this sort of British journalist who has used all kinds of creative way, sort of open source technology taken from YouTube and all kinds of other places to expose human rights violations in Russia, in Syria, and so on. And so we have this negativity bias, I think, as human beings, that we tend to focus on all the negative things and take all the positive things for granted. So, for instance, we're sitting here having an uncensored discussion in various locations around the world. We don't, at least I don't, we don't think of it as, wow, now we're exercising our freedom of speech. This is just natural. We're having this discussion, but go back a couple of 100 years and that would have been, astounding to people that they had this opportunity where we've just criticized 4 different states and various politicians. And none
but
of
Jakob, we're having this conversation on Zoom, and as Sarah can well speak to, Zoom has shut down conversations before, right, Sarah?
Yeah, last year or
it all blurs together the past 2 years.
2021. The year before that, 2020. They acted on complaints from the Chinese government over a Tiananmen memorial that was being held. And so pretty much what happened is they said the event was against the law and they had Chinese users attending the event. So Zoom shut down the event for everyone and blocked the hosts. Some were in New York, one was in Hong Kong. And, after a backlash, they realized, hey, maybe we shouldn't be applying Chinese laws globally. So I'm glad they figured that one out, but it was a little troubling. They didn't know that one already.
Yeah, I just want to do some rapid fire questions here. And I want to go to you next, Stephen. We talked a little bit about Thomas Paine. The long arc of free speech history, I want to know where you think, as a scholar of the American Revolution, that fits in. How significant compared to all the other developments, the Isagria and Parousia, the Roman Republic, Jakob, the Abyssinian Caliphate. How do you rank the American Revolution and what it was able to accomplish in that timeline?
I think it's enormously important because freedom of speech was tied really for the first time to self-governance, right? So James Madison made the point that the people were sovereign in a republic as opposed to the king and parliament. And so they had to have a full right to discuss public affairs without the threat of repression or seditious libel. And so the tying of freedom of speech, a vigorous freedom of speech. He didn't actually talk about any exceptions to it. He said Congress shall make no law. It means Congress shall make no law. So I think in large part the meaning of freedom of speech in America, the very vigorous, uninhibited, robust idea of speech supporting our Republican form of government was formed then, and it's carried through. You still see the Supreme Court in its opinions quoting Madison and that idea of free speech supporting a democratic and Republican form of government. I mean, small r there, of course, Republican form of government.
Yeah. The last question before we turn it over to questions. It looks like we've got quite a few of them. Greg, I want to go to you next. Do you think the worldwide support for free speech has reached and already perhaps passed its zenith? Jakob argues that the global club of free democracies is shrinking fast, but you call free speech, Greg, the eternally radical idea. So do you believe that in quite literal sense, that free speech will never find a place in history where it's no longer a radical idea?
Not one that I can imagine. Maybe when we're cyborgs or something, living on another planet. Why I call it the eternally radical idea is partially.
And this is Greg's blog, to be clear.
Yeah, but I'll, also it's the term that I use to describe that free speech is neither conservative nor liberal. And I always people always like to begin books and articles by saying it's like, since the dawn of time, man has longed to be free, and it's like, only because other people were trying to oppress them. So the idea that you should have free speech, people get. The idea that somebody else should have free speech is radical, and it will be opposed. It will be opposed in every generation, and people have to stand up to fight it. I do think that it's demonstrable that we had sort of a high watermark of optimism about free speech. I'd say between maybe 95 and 2005. 2005 is when the democratic recession that Jakob talks about in the book as well begins. That's Jamie Dimon's name for it, about the decreased number of democracies. So I think with the defeat of the Soviet Union, liberalism had this wonderful, sense that it had beaten Nazism, it had beaten communism, and we're back to liberalism and free speech being central to that. I think the internet had a lot of optimism around it. I think we are in a stage right now, and I like Martin Gurry's idea that we're in a fifth major wave of communications technology.
And what's his book again, Greg? Martin Gurry's? What's the name of Martin
Gurry's book? Is Revolt of the Public. He's a former CIA analyst, and he wrote a book trying to explain why things went so haywire in the past decade and why polarization got so much worse and authority got so undermined. And he thinks that we had actually underestimated how profound billions of people talking to each other in real time actually is. And I believe in that. So what I think we are in an unavoidably anarchical period where things are going to be difficult. We have to get used to something that has never been possible, the sheer scale and accessibility of talking to each other. But what I'm afraid is our desire to solve it is going to be kind of like what Henry VIII did with the printing press in 1521. Just suppression isn't going to work. So we have to figure out ways to learn to live with it. Now, of course, places like China are saying, hell with that, we're just going to try to control everything. So we're entering a very chaotic period. My co-author Jonathan Haidt thinks that this is going to be the only comparatively calm year of this decade, and it's all going to be haywire from this point in. I hope he's wrong, but I definitely think that things are going to get worse before they get better.
Greg, we have a question from someone in the audience about this Substack VP's comments. They asked, what is her position? We mentioned it in passing, but didn't really flesh it out.
Mm-hmm.
Or her position on free speech and how the platform polices its speech.
Just that by that essentially they should let people talk, and they're not going to censor. They're supposed to be the wing of the internet that people leave, the new popular newspapers in droves to actually go finally have a place where they can talk. So it's very much kind of like what I said, is that the attempt to censor, even in an enlightened way, undermines confidence in experts. Even though they think it's supposed to increase it, it actually has the reverse effect. If it's clear that people are allowed to talk on Substack, people will trust it more, because you're also trusting the listener to not immediately assume everything that Joe Rogan says is the gospel.
Yeah, speaking of Joe Rogan, I guess there was Spotify. The nice thing about the VP at Substack is that she was unequivocal in her support for the values of the platform, right? And you see this with colleges and universities all the time. They'll try and have it both ways, and then as a result, they appease nobody, and they don't have a constituency. Spotify, to a certain extent, and it did stand by Joe Rogan, but it said it's going to do all this other stuff to spread more of what they consider the truth about COVID and other controversial issues. And then you had, I think it was Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, I think just an hour ago, saying that they can do more to address it. So it always unnerves me a little bit when you have the government saying that about a private company, and you worry about ministries of truth and whatnot. Because it wasn't so long ago, for example, where Facebook was taking down posts about from people who posited a lab leak theory, and then Joe Biden has the CIA go investigate it. we got another question from Antonia. She wants to know what your take on the modern communication theory of the spiral of silence and the way it produces some kind of social and self-restriction from free speech. Is there anyone who's familiar with that theory? I think, Greg, you are. Jakob, are you?
I'm not, but is that the one that that says that free speech is used to silence because people are afraid, if they're attacked by trolls or and that people self-censor basically because the tone is so harsh online. I don't know if that's what it refers to.
It's a little bit more like the emperor's new clothes idea, the idea of
Okay.
pluralistic ignorance, that essentially as soon as there is an incident that sort of enforces a norm, people tend to think the norm is much more common than it is, and it leads to this downward spiral where suddenly nobody's talking about anything. And I do think that the in higher education, we just did a this year we started doing a scholar database. We have 508 examples of professors getting, for lack of a better word, canceled or attempt to be canceled. And the problem there is it creates these weird little bubbles where people can't say what they honestly think, and that leads them to believe that the view they're not allowed to have is much less popular in society than it actually is. So the spiral of silence is absolutely real, and I think the best antidote to it is open-mindedness and genuine curiosity for what people really think, even if, maybe even especially if it's disturbing, strange, etc. But there's always a value in knowing what people really think, full stop.
Stephen, Sarah, anything to add on that one? The question wasn't for any particular panelist.
I think Rick really covered it. I don't think I have anything more.
We have another question from Martin, and this one's for Jakob. Martin writes, you recently had some nice words to say about your experience as a judge in the recent Danish impeachment court case, observing that it was heartening to see the full panel Supreme Court judges represent a completely unpoliticized judiciary. The question is, do you consider a politicized judiciary especially dangerous to free speech?
That's a good question. Just for reference, I was in Denmark. I don't know. Impeachment is probably not the real correct term, but a former Danish minister was put on trial by a special court, and it was only the 6th time in Danish history. And I was one of the politically appointed judges, serving with 13 Supreme Court judges for a long period. And she was found guilty and sentenced to 60 days in prison. So that's the context. I guess the politicization of a judiciary, of course, poses potentially huge problems to free speech, depending a bit on the way it's politicized. But the old-fashioned way would be to have some cronies appointed by politicians, and who will then ensure that free speech is interpreted in a way to exclude criticism of the government that is seen again and again. I'm not an expert on the U.S. Supreme Court and what the potential politicization would mean, but given that the First Amendment has been interpreted in many different ways, and that the current sort of very strong level of protection is something relatively new, I don't think it would be unimaginable to see with 3 or 4 new judges having that the current level of protection could be changed. I hope not going back to sort of 100 years ago, where if you were opposed to American involvement in World War I, you could go to jail for 10 years, and the Supreme Court would say, well, that's fine. That's not covered by the First Amendment. So yes, of course, that's a huge danger if you have a politicized judiciary, and the rule of law is essential for free speech, because you can have the best laws in the world, but if you don't have independent judiciary, if all of the judges who are meant to enforce these norms are cronies or have a specific political orientation, then they won't matter much.
Greg? Just I want to put my hand up because I want to make sure that before we're done, we talk about how fired Sarah McLachlan, not the singer who just turned 45 2 days ago, but our Sarah McLachlan is working on a very cool book that she just started working on, and I wanted to make sure that she was able to tell people about it before before the show's over.
Thank you. I appreciate it. First, I think I need to ask why you know her birthday, but we can discuss that.
NPR, man. They told me.
Thanks for mentioning that, Greg. I started on it about a couple months ago. As you may have, heard from my comments earlier in the discussion, I've been, pretty interested in, how China is affecting the global conversation and what they're doing with free speech. And I think it actually has a lot to do with higher education in the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe. So I'm really looking forward to finishing that up. And now that we've talked about it publicly, I have to.
So, Sarah, that actually is a good segue to an event that's happening or starting this weekend, the Olympics, right? There's been a lot of conversation around China and its human rights abuses, but also the free speech climate. You have countries telling their athletes to bring burner phones to the Olympics. Can you talk a little bit about what China's doing and whether we should be concerned about it?
Sure. So they're doing a number of different things. So obviously, there's what they're doing within the country. They've been, ramping up enforcement of censorship against activists. There have been some activists who are, on house arrest until the games are over, being told you better watch what you say if you don't want someone to get hurt for the next couple of weeks. But in addition to that, the deputy director of Beijing 2022's organizing committee actually pretty much flat out threatened at a press conference that they have, quote, dedicated departments to investigate speech from athletes that is against the Olympic spirit, especially against Chinese laws and regulations. So they've been, really openly threatening pretty much everyone who is attending the games. There could be consequences for what they do or say. In addition to that, the sponsors, they've been telling, the athletes working with them, you better watch what you say. I know the U.S. Olympic team has, warned athletes, you really shouldn't say anything until you get back. And, it's troubling that, this, supposedly high-minded international event is kind of turning into this nightmare of fear for people where they just want to go to the games and compete. But, it's more about their self-censorship than what they actually do at the games.
Jakob, you have your hand up over there.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the confidence, the worrying confidence of China. Because if you go to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin during Nazi rule, actually the Nazis eased down on censorship. They allowed certain newspapers to write stuff, and they would sort of remove Der Stürmer from sort of the public streets, those the most viciously anti-Semitic newspapers. So they would sort of show a less totalitarian image to the world during the Olympics. But the Chinese seem, not to care too much about their image when it comes to that, and are confident that they can, just use force. Lenin supposedly said, I don't think it's a true quote, that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang him. And at times I think it's quite characteristic of how Western corporations and institutions act vis-a-vis China. Cisco building the Great Firewall, and Yahoo sort of entering the Chinese market initially, sort of saying that they would uphold free speech, and then totally caving in. And then you had this Project Dragonfly by Google that was essentially incorporating Chinese dictates on to their search engine, and it was only dropped because of resistance by Google employees, and that, I think, tells us that the civil libertarian ethos that originally guided Silicon Valley is not really at the forefront anymore, and that these corporations are ultimately in it for the money, and that will trump free speech concerns as sort of the geopolitical balance is recalibrated and authoritarian states gain more power and clout.
Stephen, we've talked throughout this conversation about government censorship, for example, what China's doing, but also kind of the democratized public square and how private companies might impact it or impact the free speech conversation or the speech rights of the people who participate in it. From a historical perspective, how important do you think it is to have free speech laws properly enforced that limit what the government can do relative to the cultural value of free speech that kind of lives among the people? I think of the Spirit of Liberty speech from Learned Hand to kind of keep the free speech spirit alive, because you write in Revolutionary Dissent that despite laws that limited speech prior to the revolution breaking out, people practiced it, right? It's like they didn't need a law giving them a permission slip to speak freely.
Yes, there were seditious libel laws that came from England back in the 13th century, and they were they came ashore in colonial America, and colonial governors, British royal governors threatened to use them against a whole variety of publications. So the law of seditious libel existed, and it was a criminal law. So if you criticized the government, in this case George III or Parliament or the royal governor, you could be prosecuted and put in jail for that. And there were a lot of prosecutions in the 17th century, but in the 18th century you see a lot of pushback. And so once protest breaks out against the British, the common law of seditious libel is just ignored, and it's a free-for-all. And that's how the American Revolution came about, because it involved a very radical change of opinion on the part of the people, from being loyal subjects of the crown to being rebels who were breaking away. And that whole process involved criticizing the king, criticizing the parliament, and a lot of that under seditious libel laws was illegal. So there was a common understanding of speech that went beyond what a legal scholar of the time would, like Blackstone, would say. Here's what speech means. It only means freedom from censorship, prior restraint. Now in America, it meant a lot more than that. It meant the freedom to go out in the streets and protest. It meant writing essays and pamphlets and criticizing the king. And that was unprecedented.
Now, but to do that, you kind of need, or people who want to ignore the law, the seditious libel law, they need a little bit of breathing room to do it and to get it off the ground, to hit that critical mass. Do you think something like that is possible in a foreign country such as China right now? Or are the means of censorship so extreme there that getting yourself that initial breathing room to hit critical mass is difficult?
I think it's very difficult in a country like China, because there's such extensive controls. I mean, I deal with this. I have a lot of students from China, graduate students in journalism, and they talk about the controls. And when they come to the United States and they start writing about politics and business and so forth, they can write freely, and it's what a breath of fresh air, literally, for them. Nobody is looking over their shoulder. I had one student I'll never forget. We were talking about an article that was critical of the American government. I forget what president, but a student raised her hand, and she said, from China, she said, in my country, I'd be in jail if I wrote that. So the extensive nature of it, unless you have channels of communication that the government can't, encrypted, for example, that the government can't intrude on, it's very difficult or impossible.
Greg, we have a question here from an anonymous listener. Among some campus activists, there is the feeling that free speech has been used as a tool by the white elitist power establishment to keep down poor people and people of color. Hence, some of the rebellion of unfettered free speech can be seen as a revolt of oppressed classes against the establishment. Comments? ?
Yeah, I just think that's just dead wrong. Well, one thing I did want to say before that is that Jakob's book is amazing. I want to be very clear about that. And his podcast on global free speech, I just adored. I couldn't rant about it enough. It was great.
And I should say, when I was writing my intro to this, I was like, and he's the author of Free Speech, which just kind of was like a weird thing to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great book and a great podcast series. So this is something that I just feel like has been badly misrepresented to younger people. So let's go back in history. There is an idea that essentially, I talk about the 3 Bs, that essentially people growing up, particularly in wealthy, in the upper, like say, quartile of the United States, are being taught that essentially free speech is the argument of the 3 Bs, the bigot, the bully, and the robber baron. And that's partially the result of the fact there being a high level of political homogeneity in K through 12 teachers and in higher education. Now, how do I get there? Here's what I'm saying. If you believe that free speech is the weapon of the rich and powerful, I got news for you. The rich and powerful do great in history. They do great in history, period, because they are rich and powerful. Once you get to democratic societies, the majority gets to decide. So the only time you need freedom of speech, both as a cultural concept, but also eventually as a legal concept, is for minority points of view. Because basically Madison realized that it would turn into the situation where 51% would always be oppressing the 49%. So free speech is always about minority rights. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence that the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the women's rights movement really got in gear in the 1950s. It is documented. All 3 of these movements, they attempted to start earlier. The Great Free Speech League that preceded the ACLU was trying to do this in the 1910s. So the problem with the political homogeneity is that when you have sort of like a super majority of people who agree with you, you start seeing very predictably free speech as a threat, as a problem. And when you think about the wealth and power of American academia, I mean, but two schools together, Harvard and Yale, they have $100 billion just sitting over to the side, and they still try to present themselves as if they're kind of helpless and kind of weak, but partially because they see that free speech can create some tensions, and absolutely it can. That's actually in some ways its highest end. It very predictably, and we all saw this coming, starting in as early as the 1980s. It starts to erode and erode and erode until free speech becomes conceived of the problem, not the solution. And the only way you can really come to that conclusion is if you assume power at some level will at least be on your side in the future. So it really scares me. I think there's this absolute inversion of what the value of free speech is for minority points of view that's happening in higher ed and K through 12 today.
Jakob, one of our listeners, Gerald, put a question squarely that we've kind of been dancing around. Do you believe that social platforms should not interfere with COVID disinformation or political disinformation that might exist on their platforms in, extemporaneous conversations such as this, right? People shooting the shit on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Well, I wish we didn't live in a sort of have such a centralized social media ecosystem, so that you didn't have to really worry about how platforms content moderated, because it wouldn't have such huge consequences.
But isn't also baked into that question the idea that there is like a centralized depository of truth, like a ministry of truth that can sort of fall?
Of course there is. It's really interesting. I urge everyone to go and read a very recent report by the British Royal Society, which on the one hand acknowledges that there are potential real harms involved in scientific misinformation, but warns strenuously against deleting and banning content, saying that is not only inefficient but also counterproductive to do so. You mentioned yourself the fact that the lab leak theory was removed and then sort of rehabilitated. But how can anyone during a pandemic, where everyone has imperfect knowledge and even experts are sort of learning new things every day, how can a social media platform do any kind of really meaningful content moderation about what is true or not? If you take the Danish health authorities, I could find 10 statements that they've made that turned out to be wrong, and many of them were criticized viciously by people on social media that where people could see this does not make sense. Like, for instance, early on, they said Danes like to go on skiing in Austria, and there was a huge outbreak in Austria, and our Danish health authority said, "Oh, go ahead, nothing will happen." And what happened? People brought COVID back to Denmark, and that really set off. And then they said, face masks, don't work. We won't recommend using face masks. And then there was a mask mandate and everything. So misinformation is just such a difficult category to content moderate and really also to legislate. But one thing I also think is, our debates about social media, to a large extent, also, I would argue, is based on myths. So we have this idea of a tsunami of misinformation and disinformation, and that is true in absolute numbers. But if you look at the share of misinformation on social media, it's actually quite limited, and a lot of research suggests that it's not as effective. So those who are most likely to fall into sort of the rabbit hole of misinformation are political tribalists. So they are the ones who are already completely committed to a certain ideology. So if you're a hardcore Trump supporter, yes, you're likely to fall for sort of crazy, deranged conspiracy theories about the presidential election. But it's not something that is likely to convince everyone. The same thing about hate speech. So my organization, we did we had a representative sample of 63 million Facebook comments from Danish politicians and media's Facebook sites, and when we evaluated them, we found that only around 0.006% of them violated the Danish penal code, which prohibits sort of incitement to terrorism, hate speech, and all these things. So this idea that social media is flooded with hate and misinformation is at best lacks a lot of nuance, and is often shaped, I think, by this negativity bias, and also by the fact that traditional media has skewed incentives when it comes to reporting about social media, because social media has taken revenue from them and also challenged their status as the institutional gatekeepers. And I don't belong to the faction who thinks that traditional media is something we can do without. I think there needs to be sort of a division of labor in knowledge production, and where it would be great if we have higher trust in traditional media, but then alternative voices can flourish on social media, and we can use what the social scientist Hugo Merger calls the open vigilance to sort of sort through what is right and wrong. And I think actually human beings are better at distinguishing between bullshit, if you want, and outright misinformation than what the public debate sort of paints a picture of. Of course, in absolute numbers, it's a lot, and of course, you only need a couple of thousand people to buy into misinformation to have an attack on the Capitol, for instance, and that, of course, is a huge problem. And let's be completely open about it. The attack on the Capitol would not have happened without social media. And if you read I think it's a Senate report, they say that one of the reasons why they didn't do anything before was the problem in discerning constitutionally protected speech from credible threats of violence. So the First Amendment, you could argue, played a role in sort of holding back authorities' response to that. And so that's why I think free speech activists have to acknowledge that free speech comes with costs and potential harms, but it does not follow that restrictions on free speech solves those issues, or that the unintended or intended consequences of speech restrictions are they very often will be a cure worse than the disease.
Well, we also have free speech is not an absolute right in the United States, like incitement to imminent lawless action, speech that's in in pursuant of criminal conspiracy, truth threats. Those are things, and that's why it's often very important that we get the facts on the ground. And it's a very fact-intensive analysis to determine whether certain speech falls within one of those exceptions to the First Amendment. And then, Stephen, you have your hand up, so do you have something to add on that front?
Yeah, I just want to add that in some areas we do make judgments about what's true and what's false. So, I mean, perjury, for example, is not protected by the First Amendment. Those are lies. It's false information. It causes great harm. Fraud causes great harm, is not protected by the First Amendment. Commercial speech has limitations. So a pharmaceutical company can't say, I've got some pills, take them and it's going to do this and that for you. There's got to be proof for it. And so in a like way, it might be possible that at least in some circumstances, one might be able to ask content moderators to intervene in situations where someone says, if you get COVID, just drink apple juice, right? It's a lie. We know it's a lie. And maybe that's something that is so clear we can regulate it.
But doesn't an apple a day keep the doctor away there, Steve?
Or drink bleach. Drink bleach.
Drink bleach. Yeah. Drink bleach.
that would seem to be sort of one of the things that could lead to very direct harms.
Yeah, but I think your larger point, of course, is correct. That it's very difficult to make these distinctions between truth and falsity, right?
Yeah.
It's, and the other thing is who's going to make those determinations?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's where you get to the Ministry of Truth question.
Yeah,
right?
who do you trust to do that? And a lot of the so-called disinformation is political speech, right? It's that goes to the very heart of what we protect in the First Amendment. So it makes it even more difficult when we're dealing with political speech.
Last question here before we sign off, and I want to present this to each of the panelists here. Who is your favorite free speech activist, or they don't even need to be an activist, exerciser of free speech, or philosopher throughout history? And Jakob, I'm going to give you the privilege of going first because you wrote a book about it, and I hope you have it top of mind. If not, we can go to someone else first.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question because I've covered so many, but I really, if you go and read Frederick Douglass, A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, his speech, after there's this abolitionist meeting in Boston, and it is disrupted by these rich white Bostonians who don't like the fact that this might disrupt their commercial interest in the South or threaten the Union. And he basically, it's a very short but powerful speech, and it really addresses more or less all the controversies, free speech controversies that we still discuss today, public-private distinction, heckler's veto, power and privilege, race and skin color, and so on. And he ends up with this universalist defense of free speech as depending not on the color of your skin or your wealth, but just by the simple quality of your manhood, and there let it rest forever. And I think that's probably the best articulation of free speech that I can think of. And I think he was great. And I think if Frederick Douglass' free speech principles sort of underpinned our free speech culture, we would be in a lot better place today than we are.
Fire has a new TikTok channel, and we've got a Frederick Douglass kind of funny educational video coming out about that precise speech. So check out the Fire.org, I think is our handle on TikTok. Speaking of a Chinese company, right? Stephen, how about you?
Oh, definitely James Madison. I referred to him earlier about making the connection between a free press and sovereignty, Republican form of governments. That's so important. But he also said, wrote in 1800 that freedom of the press is justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right. So it's not, so the press needs to be protected, not just because it's nice to protect the press, but because free discussion of public affairs and criticism of public officials, guards all our other rights. And if we lose the right to criticize government officials, especially, and criticize public policy, then the government can run roughshod over us.
It's interesting because what you're describing there is essentially free speech and doesn't even need to be cabined to the free press. I think during his time, it was often the press that was the mouthpiece to allow this criticism to happen. But now, because of social media and other means for people to independently speak out, it's almost, would he just say free speech now is the bulwark?
Yeah, they were thinking about the free press then because the press turned out newspapers and pamphlets and things like that. So it was the primary form of getting information and discussion out there.
Yeah. Sarah?
I'm less of a historian than my co-panelists, so I will probably go with a current example. But over the past couple of years, I have really been personally inspired by, the activists, the journalists, the people who are, kind of watching their freedoms crumbling in Hong Kong and are still, trying to find ways to push back against that, to still find, creative ways to, continue speaking, continue protesting. I think if you, want to be, want to see some of the people who are really caring about their rights and, trying their best to defend what's left of them, I think Hong Kong is, the place to look.
Greg?
I can't choose among my children. There's too many people. I have a running list of great books on free speech culture. John Stuart Mill gets mentioned a lot because, I used to teach John Stuart Mill in my First Amendment class because he's such a good arguer. Like he is an astounding lawyer, even though he wasn't a lawyer. So he's amazing for a reason. But in terms of people who are alive, Jonathan Rauch is one of my heroes. His book, Kindly Inquisitors, came at free speech from a much different perspective than most people do on free speech. And his Constitution of Knowledge, which came out last year, was probably my book of the year. I thought it was amazing. As far as comparative newcomers that I'm really excited about, I've been really impressed by Amna Khalid. I think that the work she's doing is really impressive. And of course, I'm very lucky to get to work with another one of my heroes, Nadine Strawson. So like I said, I can't even choose just one, but these are a lot of my favorite people.
Well, I appreciate everyone joining this conversation, taking the time, and to our 100 plus. I only checked midway through the podcast, so I don't know the peak number of people who tuned in. I appreciate you tuning in, and Jakob, Stephen, Sarah, Greg. I really appreciate you all joining the podcast again, and I hope we get to do it again sometime soon.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great chatting with you.
That was Jakob Mushingama, Greg Lukianoff, Stephen Solomon, and Sarah McLaughlin, and the book is Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. It's due out next Tuesday, February 8th, and as we promised, 50 of you who are here at the live recording will receive a free copy, so keep an eye on your emails tomorrow. And of course, we would like to again thank First Amendment Watch for co-sponsoring this conversation. You can learn more about them and access all of their educational materials at firstamendmentwatch.org. This podcast is hosted by me, Nico Perino, produced by Jackie Farmer, and edited by our colleague Aaron Reese. To learn more about So to Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. We also take listener feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org. And if you have further questions for any of our panelists, you can email me there, and I will forward it along to them, and they may or may not respond depending on their availability. But if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. Reviews of So to Speak on any of those platforms help us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, I thank you all again for listening.